For over 7 centuries, the samurai shaped the destiny of Japan, not only through battlefields, but through politics, philosophy, and power. Though often remembered for their swords, armor, and duels, the real story of the samurai runs far deeper. It is the tale of a transformation from provincial fighters to aristocratic leaders, from ruthless warriors to symbols of national identity. Who were the samurai truly? And how did a class of warriors rise to dominate Japan, only to vanish within a few short decades? This is the complete story of the samurai. Let us begin. Long before the image of the armored warrior came to define Japan's past, the roots of the samurai were quietly forming amid the fading power of an ancient imperial court. To understand them, we must look not at blades and battles, but at the slow collapse of centralized rule, the shifting tides of provincial power, and the rise of those who learned to rule through the sword. In the earliest centuries of Japan's history, authority rested in the imperial court of Heian, modern Kyoto, where the emperor and his noble aristocrats presided over a system inspired by the Chinese Tang dynasty. This Ritsuryo system sought to organize society through law, taxation, and bureaucracy. All land, in theory, belonged to the state, with farmers granted fields in exchange for labor and taxes. For a time, this system gave the emperor's court real control over the land. Yet, in practice, the vast mountains, islands, and remote provinces of Japan were difficult to manage. By the 8th and 9th centuries, the imperial reach began to fade. Officials stationed far from the capital grew corrupt or weak, and the countryside slipped out of direct control. As the court's authority weakened, aristocratic families began to claim their own territories. Many descended from imperial bloodlines and soon amassed vast estates known as shun, lands often free from taxation and imperial law. To guard their holdings, these families hired local warriors, rough, skilled men who knew the terrain and mastered archery and horseback combat. These early bushi, or fighting men, were not yet a distinct class, but their power grew rapidly as order declined. Landowners, threatened by bandits and rival clans, relied on them for security, and even the imperial court began turning to these warriors to suppress uprisings in distant regions. The rise of these provincial fighters marked the beginning of Japan's shift from a bureaucratic empire to a militarized society. By the late 9th century, the samurai way was taking shape. These men were no longer mere enforcers. They were becoming a hereditary warrior class with values rooted in loyalty, courage, and skill. The court, increasingly ceremonial and detached, could no longer ignore their growing influence. Beneath the refined surface of the Heian era, power was quietly passing from silk-robed nobles to men clad in armor. Among the warrior families, 2 clans would soon stand above all others, the Taira and the Minamoto. Both claimed imperial ancestry, yet unlike their courtly kin, they earned prestige through battle and governance in the provinces. Figures like Taira no Masakado and Minamoto no Tsunemoto became symbols of this new order, warlords with their own armies and ambitions. Masakado's rebellion in the mid-10th century, where he declared himself new emperor of the East, showed just how far samurai independence had grown. Though crushed, his revolt revealed the emperor's diminishing control and the warrior class's rising will to rule. Over generations, the samurai refined their own moral and social code. Loyalty to one's lord became sacred. Courage and discipline were expected. While the formal code of Bushido had not yet formed, its seeds were planted in the values of service, duty, and honor passed from father to son. As alliances deepened through marriage and shared defense, samurai families created a tightly woven network of loyalty and blood. The empire's fate now rested not in bureaucrats' decrees, but in the hands of warriors. By the 11th century, Japan was a fractured land of independent estates, powerful clans, and a ceremonial court clinging to symbolic authority. True power lay in the provinces. The Taira and Minamoto families emerged as rivals, their struggle destined to shape the nation. The Taira, led by the shrewd and ambitious Taira no Kiyomori, rose through both military service and cunning politics. Unlike earlier warriors, Kiyomori broke barriers, marrying into the imperial line and placing his own grandson, Emperor Antoku, upon the throne. In doing so, he blurred the boundary between noble and warrior. Under Kiyomori's command, the Taira reached the height of power. He held the title of Daijo Daijin, Grand Minister of State, the highest rank in the imperial court. But his dominance earned him powerful enemies, chief among them the Minamoto clan. Decades earlier, the Minamoto had suffered defeat and exile, yet they had not been destroyed. When Emperor Go Shirakawa, seeking to free himself from Taira control, called upon the Minamoto to rise, the country erupted into war. Minamoto no Yoritomo, once an exiled child, now became the symbol of rebellion. Alongside his brilliant half-brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, he led the uprising that would forever change Japan. The Genpei War, beginning in 1180, raged for 5 years, an epic struggle of shifting loyalties, brutal battles, and strategic brilliance. At the Battle of Uji, warriors fought on bridges torn apart beneath their feet. At Ichinotani, Yoshitsune led a daring mountain assault, crushing the Taira lines. The final confrontation came in 1185 at Dan no Ura, a naval battle fought in the narrow straits of the inland sea. The Taira, cornered and desperate, fought fiercely, but betrayal and the turning tides sealed their fate. The young Emperor Antoku was carried into the sea by his grandmother to avoid capture, and with him, the Taira dynasty sank beneath the waves. The Minamoto emerged victorious. The age of the court was over. The age of the samurai had begun. Would power simply return to the imperial court, or would something entirely new rise in its place? Minamoto no Yoritomo answered that question by establishing a military government, the Bakufu, based in Kamakura, far from the imperial capital. With that single act, he permanently altered the structure of Japanese governance. The creation of the Kamakura Shogunate in the year 1192 marked the dawn of samurai rule in Japan. Though the emperor remained a ceremonial figure in Kyoto, true political authority shifted to the shogun, a military leader governing through an intricate web of vassals and land stewards. The office of shogun was not merely an honorific title. It formalized the rule of warriors over the state. Yoritomo's brilliance lay not only in his victories on the battlefield, but in his mastery of administration. He appointed military governors, or shugo, to maintain order in the provinces, and land stewards, or jito, to manage estates and collect taxes. These roles, often hereditary, answered directly to the shogunate, allowing the Minamoto to exert power over distant lands without depending on the weakening court aristocracy. Though Yoritomo had crushed his rivals and redefined the nation's hierarchy, his rule was not without internal strife. His relationship with his brother Yoshitsune, once his most trusted general, soured beyond repair. Fearing Yoshitsune's growing fame and ambition, Yoritomo ordered his death. The fugitive Yoshitsune was eventually cornered and forced to take his own life, a tragedy immortalized in Japanese literature and theater, painting Yoshitsune as the noble martyr and Yoritomo as the cold strategist. By the close of the 12th century, Japan had changed forever. The imperial court still held its rituals and ceremonies, but true power rested with the samurai. The Genpei War had not only ended Taira dominance, but shattered the illusion of centralized aristocratic control. The sword had replaced the brush as the symbol of authority. This transformation carried deep cultural weight. The values of loyalty, discipline, and martial skill, once confined to the warrior class, became woven into Japan's identity itself. The Genpei War was not merely a battle between two clans. It was the birth of a new order. It proved that political legitimacy now depended on strength, not noble lineage. It elevated the samurai from regional enforcers to rulers of the realm. With the fall of the Taira and the rise of Minamoto no Yoritomo, a new era began. For the first time, political power no longer resided in the imperial court of Kyoto, but in a military government based in Kamakura. The Kamakura Shogunate, founded at the end of the 12th century, marked the formal beginning of samurai rule, a system forged from the needs and values of warriors. Yoritomo knew that his rise had been won by force, but enduring power required more than victories. In the year 1192, he was officially granted the title Sei-ai Taishogun, barbarian, subduing general. Once a temporary title, Yoritomo transformed it into a permanent political institution. This marked the beginning of the Bakufu, the military government that would dominate Japan for the next 7 centuries. From Kamakura, a coastal city deliberately distant from Kyoto, Yoritomo governed free from the influence of court nobles, while still acknowledging the emperor's symbolic role. Thus emerged a dual system of authority. The emperor performed sacred duties, while the shogun wielded actual power. Yoritomo's greatest administrative innovation was creating a parallel power structure. He appointed Shugo to enforce order in the provinces and Jito to manage estates and taxes. These positions, often hereditary, bound samurai loyalty directly to the shogunate and ensured local control without centralized bureaucracy. This system relied not on written law but on personal loyalty, service, and land rights, principles deeply rooted in samurai ethics. When Yoritomo died in 1199, power passed not to another Minamoto, but to his widow's family, the Hojo clan. His wife, Hojo Masako, called the Nun Shogun for her vows and political acumen, guided the transition. Her father, Hojo Tokimasa, became the first shikken, or regent, for the shogun. Under this regency system, shoguns became figureheads while the Hojo regents held real authority, controlling appointments and policies. The hierarchy was now layered. The emperor held divine legitimacy, the shogun was the nominal ruler, and the regents governed behind the scenes. Though complex, this structure sustained stability for over a century. In the year 1232, the shogunate issued the Joi Shikimoku, a legal code outlining rules for land disputes, inheritance, and vassal conduct. Unlike the aristocratic laws of old, it reflected warrior ideals, justice, loyalty, and order. Religious life also flourished. Pure Land Buddhism appealed to the common people, while Zen Buddhism captivated the samurai elite. Zen's emphasis on discipline, meditation, and insight mirrored the warrior's path and would later shape samurai philosophy. Culturally, the Kamakura era broke from the refined elegance of the Heian court. Literature and art turned toward realism, impermanence, and moral struggle. Texts like Hojoki and the Tale of the Heike captured the transience of power and the suffering of war, lessons that resonated deeply in a society forged by conflict. The shogunate maintained a careful balance with the imperial court, preserving its rituals for legitimacy while keeping real control in Kamakura. This uneasy harmony kept peace, but tension simmered beneath the surface. By the early 13th century, the Kamakura shogunate stood as Japan's dominant power, held together by loyalty, military might, and administrative innovation. But its strength was also its weakness. Dependence on vassal loyalty and hereditary offices made unity fragile. That fragility would soon be tested not by internal rivals, but by an empire unlike any Japan had ever faced. Across the sea, the Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, had become the most formidable force on earth. Stretching from the steppes of Asia to the edges of Europe, the Mongols had crushed kingdoms with speed and brutality. Japan, isolated yet proud, had never faced such a threat. When the Mongols turned their gaze eastward, the samurai faced a new kind of war, one that would challenge their weapons, their will, and the very foundation of their rule. In the year 1268, Kublai Khan sent envoys demanding Japan's submission. The Kamakura rulers refused. For 6 years, diplomatic warnings went unanswered. By the year 1274, Kublai Khan's patience ran out. The first Mongol invasion had begun. Estimates differ, but most historians agree that the invading force numbered more than 20,000 men. The fleet crossed the Tsushima Strait, landing first on the islands of Tsushima and Aiki before advancing toward Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands. For the samurai, this encounter was unlike anything they had ever faced. The Mongols fought with strategy, coordination, and precision, relying on disciplined infantry, archers, and tactical formations. The Japanese, by contrast, were accustomed to personal combat, duels between warriors who declared their names, ancestry, and achievements before fighting one-on-one. The Mongols had no patience for such ritual. They advanced in ranks, beat war drums to direct movement, and hurled explosive projectiles that filled the air with smoke and fire. The defenders were stunned. The Mongols overran the coastal defenses and seized parts of northern Kyushu, including Hakata Bay. The samurai fought with fierce determination, but their efforts were fragmented, lacking unity or central command. Then, as if summoned by fate, a violent storm struck. Japanese accounts describe it as a typhoon that shattered ships, drowned thousands, and scattered the Mongol fleet. Within days, the invaders withdrew, and the first Mongol invasion ended almost as suddenly as it began. The storm was hailed as divine intervention, a sacred wind, a kamikaze sent by the gods to shield Japan. This belief would echo through the ages, becoming a symbol of the nation's divine protection and unyielding spirit. But the Kamakura government knew the danger had not passed. Preparations for a second invasion began immediately. Stone and earth walls were raised along the coasts of Kyushu, especially around Hakata Bay. Garrisons were reinforced, weapons stockpiled, and samurai mobilized for long-term defense. Yet, across the sea, Kublai Khan was undeterred. In the year 1281, he launched a second, far greater invasion. Historians estimate that more than 100,000 men, Mongols, Chinese, and Koreans, set sail aboard thousands of ships, forming one of the largest naval forces the pre-modern world had ever seen. Their plan was to unite off Kyushu and crush the Japanese defenses under sheer weight of numbers, but fate again turned against them. The Korean fleet arrived first, the southern Chinese fleet much later, causing confusion and delay. The Japanese took advantage, launching daring night raids in small boats, boarding enemy ships, and setting them ablaze. For weeks, the struggle raged without clear victory. Then once more, the heavens intervened. A second typhoon roared through the seas, tearing the Mongol armada to pieces. Thousands of ships were smashed against the rocks or sunk in the storm. Tens of thousands of men drowned. The few survivors were hunted down or captured by Japanese defenders. The invasion was annihilated, and Kublai Khan's dream of conquering Japan was over. The consequences were profound. On the surface, Japan had triumphed. The shogunate's prestige soared, and the myth of divine protection became a cornerstone of national identity. Yet beneath the triumph lay deep cracks. The mobilization had drained the Kamakura government's finances and stretched its resources to the limit. Thousands of samurai had been summoned to defend the coast, abandoning their lands and livelihoods. And unlike domestic wars, foreign defense yielded no spoils, no conquered territories, no captured riches to distribute as rewards. Samurai who had fought bravely returned home expecting compensation, only to find the shogunate unable to pay them. Frustration grew. Loyalty eroded. The Hojo regents, once respected stewards of order, now faced rising discontent and dwindling revenues. The The cost of coastal fortifications and continuous readiness further strained their authority. Psychologically, the Mongol invasions left a lasting scar. Japan had survived not through superior strength, but through storms, through nature itself. The kamikaze became both a source of pride and a symbol of vulnerability. The samurai's courage was undeniable, but the fragility of their government had been exposed. Meanwhile, across the sea, the Mongol Empire, though still vast, began to fracture. The defeat in Japan was one of Kublai Khan's rare humiliations. His empire remained mighty, but his reach had limits. In Japan, the immediate threat was gone, yet the aftershocks continued. The Kamakura shogunate became defensive, rigid, and inward-looking. Dissatisfaction spread among warriors and nobles alike. The Hojo regency, once firm, now appeared fragile. Ambitious men began to see opportunity in its weakness. As the 14th century dawned, that opportunity took shape in the person of an emperor, one who refused to remain a powerless figurehead. His name was Emperor Go-Daigo, and he was determined to reclaim imperial authority. The balance between Kamakura and Kyoto had always been delicate. Though the court had long been stripped of power, it remained a symbol of divine legitimacy. Within its ancient halls, emperors dreamed of restoring direct rule. Go-Daigo was different from his predecessors, bold, visionary, and defiant. He ascended the throne at a time when the Hojo's grip was slipping, when the samurai were restless, and when corruption had spread through the shogunate. He began quietly forming alliances with discontented warriors and sympathetic courtiers, preparing for revolt. In the year 1331, he made his move. Rallying support from western provinces, he launched an uprising against the Hojo, but it was premature. The rebellion failed, and the emperor was captured and exiled to the remote Oki Islands. Even in exile, Go-Daigo did not yield. Unrest spread across the provinces. Among those sent to suppress it was Ashikaga Takauji, a powerful general of Minamoto descent loyal to the shogunate. But when ordered to fight for the Hojo, Takauji chose betrayal over obedience. He turned his army against Kamakura's masters, seized Kyoto, and invited the exiled emperor to return. At the same time, another warlord, Nita Yoshisada, led a fierce assault on Kamakura itself. In the year 1333, the city fell. The Hojo regents were annihilated, their power extinguished in fire and blood. The Kamakura shogunate, Japan's first military government, collapsed after nearly 150 years of rule. Go-Daigo returned to Kyoto in triumph, declaring the restoration of imperial rule, the Kenmu Restoration. His vision was to rebuild the old order, restore imperial authority, and strip the samurai government of power. At first, the dream seemed real. New laws were proclaimed. The bureaucracy was revived. Titles and lands were reassigned. For a brief moment, it appeared that the age of the samurai had ended, and the emperor had reclaimed his throne. But the restoration soon began to unravel. Go-Daigo had underestimated how crucial the samurai had become to governance. Many warriors who had supported his return expected rewards, land, titles, and political influence. Instead, Go-Daigo favored court nobles and reinstated civil aristocrats in key positions. This alienated the very warriors whose loyalty had secured his return. Ashikaga Takawaji, who had played a decisive role in the shogunate's downfall, was among the discontented. Feeling overlooked and alarmed by the court's attempts to restore aristocratic privileges, Takawaji broke with the emperor. In the year 1335, he raised an army against Go-Daigo, claiming the emperor had failed to govern justly. A new civil war erupted between imperial loyalists and Takawaji's forces. The conflict was brutal, chaotic, and involved shifting alliances and battles across multiple provinces. Ultimately, Ashikaga Takawaji emerged victorious. He captured Kyoto and installed a rival emperor under his own military faction, while Go-Digo fled south and established a rival court in Yoshino. This schism, known as the Northern and Southern Courts period, or Nanbokucho, would endure for over half a century. In 1338, Ashikaga Takawaji declared himself shogun, founding the Ashikaga or Muromachi Shogunate. This marked the beginning of a new military regime, one that sought to learn from the failures of both the Kamakura government and the Kemmu restoration. While still relying on the samurai for control, Takawaji's shogunate attempted to balance power between warrior lords and the imperial court. Although this balance remained fragile, the brief Kemmu restoration had revealed structural shifts in Japanese society. The court could no longer govern without samurai cooperation. The warrior class had become not only the muscle of the state, but also administrators, governors, and judges. Efforts to marginalize them were doomed to fail. At the same time, the restoration showed the limits of imperial legitimacy. Go-Digo had relied on divine sanction to assert his right to rule, but actual power depended on military backing. The fall of the Kamakura shogunate and the failure of the Kemmu restoration marked the end of one phase of samurai rule and the beginning of another. Japan had entered a more complex era. The dream of restoring the old imperial order had come and gone. Now the challenge was governing a fractured nation where multiple courts claimed legitimacy and powerful warlords pursued their own ambitions. With the collapse of the Kamakura shogunate and the failure of the Kemmu restoration, Japan entered another era of warrior rule, this time under different conditions. Ashikaga Takawaji's seizure of power in the mid-14th century marked the beginning of the Ashikaga or Muromachi shogunate. While he succeeded in establishing a military government, the political landscape he inherited was far less stable than that of his Kamakura predecessors. The Ashikaga would preside over both cultural brilliance and prolonged civil strife, revealing how fragile centralized warrior rule could be. The Muromachi period, named after the Kyoto district where the Ashikaga built their headquarters, began in 1338 when Takawaji formally assumed the title of shogun. Unlike the Kamakura Bakufu, which operated distant from the imperial court, the Ashikaga placed their government close to the emperor, physically and symbolically. This reflected Takawaji's alliance with the court and his desire to derive legitimacy even as military authority remained firmly in samurai hands. Yet national unity remained elusive. Emperor Go-Digo, overthrown by Takawaji, established a rival court in Yoshino south of Kyoto. This began the Northern and Southern Courts period, during which two imperial lines claimed legitimacy. The Southern Court, led by Go-Digo and his descendants, insisted on an unbroken sacred lineage of emperors. The Northern Court, backed by the Ashikaga, installed emperors effectively under shogunal control. This dual monarchy caused symbolic and practical confusion. Local warlords were forced to choose sides, extending the struggle for legitimacy over decades. While the Northern Court held political and military advantage, the Southern Court retained strong ideological appeal. The war continued until a partial reconciliation in the late 14th century, bringing the two courts under a single imperial line. By then, however, the emperor's role had become largely ceremonial. Real power in Japan belonged to regional warlords or daimyos, many of whom owed only nominal allegiance to the Ashikaga shogunate. These lords controlled large territories, maintained private armies, and often acted as semi-independent rulers. The shogunate's capacity to enforce national policy was weak. Takawaji had relied on provincial warriors to defeat his enemies and, after seizing power, had little choice but to reward them with land and titles, further decentralizing authority. Successive Ashikaga shoguns sought to assert control with varying success. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, ruling in the late 14th century, was perhaps the most powerful. He negotiated the reunification of the imperial courts in 1392 and stabilized Kyoto. Yoshimitsu also strengthened relations with Ming China, accepting a tributary relationship in exchange for regulated trade. Though controversial, this move brought economic benefit and demonstrated the shogunate's capacity to act internationally. Yoshimitsu was also a patron of the arts, initiating what became the Kitayama cultural renaissance. Architecture, painting, theater, and gardens flourished under his sponsorship. The iconic Kinkaku-ji, or Golden Pavilion, was built during his reign and remains a symbol of classical Japanese aesthetics. Zen Buddhism spread widely among the warrior elite, influencing ink painting, tea ceremonies, and other cultural expressions. In these ways, the Muromachi period represented a high point of medieval Japanese refinement. Yet beneath this cultural and political achievement lay structural weaknesses. The Ashikaga shogunate lacked the administrative capacity of the Kamakura government. There was no centralized taxation system. Authority rested on personal loyalty rather than institutional power. As daimyos grew more autonomous, the bonds holding the country together frayed, eventually erupting into full-scale conflict with the Onin War in 1467. Ostensibly a succession dispute within the Ashikaga family, the war escalated into a nationwide struggle for power. Major daimyos aligned with rival factions, turning Kyoto into a battlefield. Over the following decade, the capital was devastated by urban warfare, fires, and looting. Aristocratic families fled, and the shogunate's authority collapsed. The Onin War marked the beginning of the Sengoku, or Warring States period, a century of fragmentation, shifting alliances, and constant regional conflict. Central authority, whether imperial or shogunal, became largely irrelevant. Power depended on military strength, land control, and the loyalty of retainers. Traditional hierarchies shifted. Ambitious warlords could rise through battlefield success, while samurai served as warriors, castle governors, strategists, and advisors. Warfare became organized on a larger scale with permanent armies and fortified castle towns. By the late 15th century, the Ashikaga shogunate existed in name only, its shoguns figureheads manipulated by provincial powers. Even Kyoto was divided among rival factions. In retrospect, the Ashikaga era was a time of brilliance and breakdown. Zen-inspired aesthetics, no theater, ink painting, and architectural harmony remain influential. Politically, the failure to centralize power or maintain daimyo loyalty set the stage for a century of internal warfare. The fragility of Muromachi rule reveals that military dominance alone could not guarantee stability. The Ashikaga shoguns wore authority but lacked the structures to contain the ambitions of regional lords. As Japan descended into Muromachi-era conflict, a quieter transformation was underway, defining the samurai not only as warriors but as bearers of culture, discipline, and philosophy. This change was closely linked to Zen Buddhism, a tradition imported from China that found a lasting home among Japan's warrior elite. Zen, or Chan in Chinese, had been introduced through monastic exchanges with the Song dynasty. By the 14th and 15th centuries, under the Ashikaga, it deeply influenced samurai life. Military rulers, including Yoshimitsu and his successors, actively patronized Zen temples, abbots, and teachings. What began as religious practice expanded into cultural influence, reshaping samurai values and aesthetics. Zen's appeal to the samurai was deliberate. Unlike esoteric rituals of earlier Buddhist schools, Zen emphasized direct experience, discipline, and self-realization through meditation. It prioritized silence, simplicity, and mental clarity. For warriors facing death and burdens of duty, Zen offered a spiritual framework resonant with their harsh realities. One of the central disciplines of Zen was Zazen, or seated meditation. This quiet act of stilling the mind and refining awareness became a cornerstone of samurai mental discipline. In an age of endless upheaval and sudden bloodshed, Zen offered a form of inner balance that stood above the chaos of the outer world. Monks taught that fear of death could not be conquered through denial, but through acceptance. by embracing impermanence as the unchanging law of life. This teaching transformed the samurai's philosophy entirely. Death was no longer an enemy to be feared, but a mirror of readiness, purity, and release. Within Zen, the instant of death could awaken enlightenment. To the warrior, it became the moment to prove loyalty, virtue, and mastery of self. Zen also reshaped the aesthetic world of the samurai. The serene austerity of Zen temples, gardens, and calligraphy inspired an elegance that valued essence over embellishment. Samurai households began to reflect this minimalist beauty in their living spaces, garments, and manners. Ink painting, or sumi-e, rose to prominence. Its bold strokes, deliberate emptiness, and spontaneous spirit capturing the quiet strength of mountains, lost in mist, or lone pines weathering the wind. Architecture followed the same path. Temples, such as Ryoanji and Tenryuji, were crafted with unadorned lines, raw wood, and perfect harmony with nature. Their stone gardens, or karisansui, portrayed seas, rivers, and mountains through silent arrangements of rock, inviting contemplation without a single word. The tea ceremony, or chanoyu, also emerged as a defining ritual linked deeply with Zen ideals. Though tea had long been drunk in Japan, Zen masters elevated it into a meditative art of simplicity and presence. Guided by teachers such as Murata Juko and later Senno Rikyu, chanoyu became an embodiment of wabi-sabi, the beauty of humility, imperfection, and impermanence. Samurai lords did not partake for leisure alone, but as training in awareness and restraint. Each gathering demanded precision, modesty, and silent focus, the same mental clarity that battle required. Literature too began to change. Warrior monks and samurai scholars wrote reflections blending Zen understanding with the realities of combat. Their words were spare, exact, and filled with meditations on action, time, and emptiness. These writings traveled among the literate elite and shaped a new warrior identity that bound the sword with the spirit. Zen's reach extended into military instruction itself. Masters began to stress not only technique, but the stillness of the mind behind the strike. The ideal samurai was calm, decisive, and unflinching, able to act without hesitation and to meet death without fear. This merging of discipline and awareness formed the philosophical roots of what would later be known as Bushido, the way of the warrior. Yet Zen was never the sole faith of the samurai. Other Buddhist traditions, such as Pure Land and Nichiren, thrived among the common classes and lower-ranking soldiers, while Shinto beliefs in spirits and ancestral reverence continued to shape Japan's moral fabric. Still, Zen held a sacred place among the elite. Its quiet rigor mirrored the vision of the perfect warrior, detached, balanced, inwardly free. Under the Ashikaga Shogunate, Japan became a crucible of artistic and spiritual exchange. Monks voyaged between China and Japan carrying new forms of art, architecture, and philosophy. Their temples became not only sanctuaries but centers of diplomacy, education, and cultural innovation. Monasteries such as Kenninji and Myoshinji rose as beacons of refinement during political disorder, preserving learning and artistry amid chaos. Yet no philosophy, however serene, could shield Japan from the storms ahead. As the Muromachi government fractured and regional lords grew stronger, war returned to the land. The Onin War would ignite, and with it, the collapse of what remained of central rule. By the mid-15th century, the Ashikaga Shogunate stood hollow, its authority divided by rival warlords and internal strife. What began as a dispute of succession erupted into one of the most ruinous wars in Japan's medieval age. At its center stood Ashikaga Yoshimasa, the 8th shogun. Lacking an heir for most of his reign and consumed by aesthetic pursuits rather than governance, Yoshimasa devoted himself to architecture, the tea ceremony, and the creation of gardens whose elegance would later define the Higashiyama style. But his neglect left a void. When his son Yoshihisa was born late in his life, factions rose in dispute. His brother Yoshimi was supported by the Hosokawa clan, while the Yamana clan stood behind the infant heir. What began as rivalry within the court soon swelled into open conflict. By the summer of 1467, armies marched into Kyoto. The city became a battlefield, and the Onin War began. The fighting dragged on for over a decade. Kyoto burned from end to end. Entire districts vanished in flame, noble houses were pillaged, and centuries of cultural treasures turned to ash. What started as a quarrel over succession dissolved into chaos. Alliances shifted endlessly as daimyo fought not for justice, but for land, power, and revenge. The shogunate, powerless to restore order, disintegrated. Yoshimasa himself withdrew into seclusion, building his silver pavilion while the capital crumbled around him. When the bloodshed finally ceased in 1477, the nation that emerged was unrecognizable. The shogunate existed in name alone. The emperor's court was reduced to ceremony without power. The land fractured into countless domains ruled by warlords who recognized no higher authority. This age became known as the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, a century of endless strife where might was law. Each daimyo ruled his own province like a king, raising armies, fortifying castles, and enforcing local rule. Political legitimacy mattered less than strength. Ambition and skill, not birth, became the new measure of power. Castle towns rose across the countryside, serving as both fortresses and administrative centers, symbols of a world governed by the sword. Yet even as war consumed the nation, the spirit of Zen endured. The artists, scholars, and monks who fled Kyoto carried their teachings into the provinces, spreading the values of simplicity, awareness, and restraint. In the midst of destruction, the idea of harmony survived. By the dawn of the Sengoku era, the samurai was no longer just a warrior. He was a man of refinement and self-discipline, wielding both the blade and the brush. His code demanded loyalty, calmness in death, and reverence for impermanence. Zen had not created this ideal, but it had purified it, shaping a class whose silence held more power than words, and whose stillness could strike deeper than any sword. In the ruins of war, the fusion of meditation and mastery gave birth to a legend, one that would outlast the age itself and define Japan for centuries to come. This movement carried classical culture into the countryside, where local rulers began to fund temples, schools, and artistic endeavors. Ironically, the devastation of Japan's cultural heart led to the enrichment of its outer provinces. Yet the rise of regional powers brought deep suffering. Peasants endured endless hardships as armies ravaged fields, seized food, and forced labor. Banditry grew rampant. Villages built fortifications and formed self-defense leagues called iki, some evolving into major political and military powers. Religious institutions too armed themselves. Buddhist sects such as the Jodo Shinshu organized militant communities known as Iko-Iki, who defied samurai rule and challenged both shogun and emperor. These movements blended faith and rebellion, adding to the turmoil of a fractured Japan. By the late 15th century, the legacy of the Onin War was clear. Central authority had crumbled, leaving Japan a patchwork of rival domains. The Ashikaga shoguns still claimed power from Kyoto, but their rule was symbolic. Real strength belonged to those who could raise armies, secure territory, and form alliances. This marked a new age for the samurai, no longer mere retainers, but political architects shaping Japan's destiny. Without true imperial or shogunal control, order depended on the will of powerful daimyo. After the collapse of centralized power, Japan entered its most violent and transformative era, the Sengoku period, the age of warring states. For over a century, the land was torn by ambition, endless war, and the hunger of samurai lords for supremacy. In this lawless age, the sword, not the decree, decided authority. The Sengoku era began in the late 15th century, as the Ashikaga shogunate lost all governing ability. The emperor remained a hollow symbol, the shogun an empty name. What replaced them was a mosaic of autonomous domains ruled by local lords who built castles, trained armies, and governed like kings. Japan had fractured into dozens of small, self-contained states. At the core of this transformation stood the castle. Once military elites lived in Kyoto or managed distant estates, but constant war demanded fortresses, both strongholds and centers of rule. Around these castles grew bustling towns of merchants, craftsmen, and officials who thrived under the daimyo's protection. These castle towns became the beating hearts of the new Japan. Society itself became militarized. Armies no longer consisted only of mounted samurai. Peasants were drafted as Ashigaru foot soldiers, armed with spears and, later, guns. They trained in disciplined formations, turning warfare into a science of coordination and endurance. New weapons and tactics changed the face of battle. The arrival of Portuguese traders in the mid-16th century introduced firearms that Japanese smiths swiftly improved and mass-produced. Matchlocks and volley fire soon became standard among elite armies, transforming the art of war. Amid the chaos, great leaders rose. Among them were Takeda Shingen, Uesugi Kenshin, and Date Masamune. Takeda Shingen, the Lord of Kai, was famed for brilliant strategy and rigid discipline. His legal reforms and cavalry tactics made him both feared and respected. His rival, Uesugi Kenshin of Echigo, the Dragon of Echigo, was a devout warrior monk who worshipped Bishamonten, the god of war. Their clashes at Kawanakajima became legendary symbols of the Sengoku struggle. Later came Date Masamune, the one-eyed dragon of the northeast. Charismatic and ruthless, he expanded his realm, encouraged trade, and even sent envoys to Spain and the Vatican. These warlords were not only conquerors, but builders. They surveyed lands, reformed taxes, stabilized currencies, and built roads. Their rule laid the groundwork for future governance. Power now required more than strength. It required administration. Religion, too, shaped this violent age. While Zen Buddhism influenced the warrior elite, sects like Jodo Shinshu gained immense popularity among peasants. Armed Buddhist leagues defied daimyo control, defending their fortified temples against suppression. Meanwhile, Christianity entered Japan through Jesuit missionaries led by Francis Xavier in 1549. The faith spread among peasants and lords alike, often encouraged by daimyo seeking trade or allies against Buddhist rivals. Yet Christianity also sowed new divisions, setting the stage for future conflict. Foreign trade flourished as European ships exchanged firearms and goods for Japanese silver and lacquerware. Merchant cities like Sakai and Nagasaki prospered, supplying armies and amassing power independent of their lords. Despite endless war, the Sengoku period sparked a cultural bloom. The tea ceremony, refined by Sen no Rikyu, emphasized discipline and simplicity. No theater, ink painting, and garden design flourished as daimyo used art to project legitimacy and refinement. By the late 16th century, Japan had become a land of dozens of rival domains, each a miniature kingdom. The Ashikaga shogunate had collapsed entirely, and even the emperor's influence had waned. Yet, from this storm of chaos, a new leader emerged, a man whose vision would reshape Japan. His name was Oda Nobunaga. Born in 1534 to a minor daimyo of Owari province, Nobunaga's beginnings were modest. Surrounded by stronger neighbors, he was dismissed as erratic, impulsive, and dangerous. But behind that unpredictability lay brilliance. After his father's death, Nobunaga seized control of his clan through audacity and intimidation, crushing rivals and consolidating power. His rise was swift and merciless. In 1560, he faced the powerful Imagawa Yoshimoto at the Battle of Okehazama. Outnumbered and underestimated, Nobunaga launched a surprise attack during a thunderstorm, catching the enemy off guard. Yoshimoto was slain, and Nobunaga's legend was born. That day marked the rise of a new force, a leader who would turn Japan's age of war into the path toward unification. From that moment, Nobunaga's power grew with extraordinary speed. He built alliances, crushed rival clans, and absorbed their lands into his expanding realm. Unlike most daimyo of his era, Nobunaga refused to be bound by old traditions. He embraced foreign trade, adopted new technologies, and pursued any idea that advanced his strategic vision. One of his greatest innovations was the full-scale integration of firearms into warfare. While the Portuguese had introduced guns decades earlier, many Japanese warlords doubted their usefulness. Nobunaga saw their potential immediately. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he deployed thousands of arquebusiers behind wooden barricades, firing in coordinated volleys. The result was a catastrophic defeat for Takeda Katsuyori, whose cavalry was decimated by disciplined gunfire. This victory marked the dawn of modern warfare in Japan. Nobunaga also restructured his armies with unprecedented organization. He established systems for supply, logistics, and standardized training, allowing his forces to move rapidly and fight in complex multi-stage operations. He rejected the rigid hierarchies of feudalism, promoting men for talent rather than lineage. This merit-based command made his armies fiercely loyal and astonishingly efficient. But Nobunaga's ambitions went beyond battlefields. He sought to destroy every institution that challenged his authority. The most powerful among them were the militant Buddhist sects, particularly the Ikko-Ikki, vast networks of armed monks and peasants. Their fortresses at Ishiyama Honganji and Mount Hiei stood as symbols of defiance. Nobunaga answered with absolute ruthlessness. In 1571, he ordered the complete annihilation of the Enryakuji temple complex on Mount Hiei, home to the mighty Tendai sect. Thousands of monks and civilians were slaughtered. It shocked the nation, but it worked. In the years that followed, Nobunaga broke the remaining strongholds of the Ikko-Ikki, bringing religious armies under heel. His cruelty was not chaos. It was strategy. The calculated dismantling of spiritual authority to secure secular rule. Nobunaga's vision also transformed Japan's economy. He established Rakuichi Rakuza, free markets that abolished merchant guild monopolies and opened trade to all. Castle towns flourished under his patronage, becoming centers of commerce and craftsmanship. He encouraged merchants and artisans to settle near his strongholds, fueling prosperity and strengthening his political base. He also cultivated ties with European traders and Jesuit missionaries. He allowed Christian preaching and granted missionaries protection, not from piety but pragmatism. Christianity weakened his Buddhist rivals and ensured steady access to foreign goods and firearms. By the late 1570s, Nobunaga ruled much of central Japan, including Kyoto itself. He installed Ashikaga Yoshiaki as puppet shogun, then dismissed him when his purpose was served. The shogunate was abolished in all but name. Power now rested entirely in Nobunaga's hands. His authority came not from ancient titles but from conquest. Yet ambition breeds enemies. In 1582, while preparing to subdue the Mori clan in the west, Nobunaga was betrayed by his own general, Akechi Mitsuhide. Caught off guard at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto, Nobunaga was surrounded. Refusing capture, he took his own life. Japan was stunned. The man who had broken centuries of chaos was gone in a single night. But his work endured. He had reshaped Japan's military, shattered feudal religion, and forged the blueprint for unification. The task of completing that vision would fall to another, his most unlikely successor. Toyotomi Hideyoshi had once been Nobunaga's sandal-bearer. Born to a peasant family in Owari province, he possessed no noble blood, no lineage, no right to rule. Yet, through brilliance, cunning, and loyalty, he rose through the ranks with astonishing speed. By the time of Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi was already a senior commander, known for his discipline, diplomacy, and uncanny political instinct. When Nobunaga fell, Hideyoshi acted instantly. Within days, he crushed Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki, avenging his master and assuming control of the Oda faction. In the years that followed, he outmaneuvered all rivals, even Nobunaga's own kin. By the mid-1580s, Hideyoshi commanded central Japan. He defeated the Mori in the west, the Hojo in the east, and by 1590, after the siege of Odawara, the last great resistance had fallen. From Kyushu to the Kanto, every major daimyo submitted. Although he lacked samurai ancestry and could not claim the title of shogun, the emperor granted him the title of Kampaku, imperial regent, later Taiko, or retired regent. His power was absolute. But unlike Nobunaga, whose rule was forged by conquest, Hideyoshi sought permanence through order. He knew that force alone could not bind a divided nation. To secure peace, he restructured society itself. In 1588, he issued the Katanagari, or sword hunt edict. All non-samurai, peasants, monks, and merchants were forbidden to own weapons. Officials swept through towns and temples, seizing swords, spears, and armor. The purpose was twofold: to prevent uprisings and to define the boundaries of class. The sword hunt ended centuries of blurred social lines. It marked the samurai as a distinct warrior class and stripped the common people of arms. It was both a security measure and a symbol. The final end of the Sengoku world, where any farmer might once have risen with a blade. Hideyoshi then formalized social divisions. Peasants were tied to their land. Samurai were required to live in castle towns under their lord's surveillance. Movement between classes was forbidden. It was strict, even oppressive, but it worked. Japan, after 100 years of chaos, was finally stable. To manage the new order, Hideyoshi conducted the Taiko Kenchi, a nationwide land survey measuring rice yields and defining taxable wealth. It standardized property, clarified rights, and strengthened the state's grip over every province. This became the backbone of Japan's governance for centuries to come. His religious policies shifted over time. At first, he tolerated Christianity, even welcomed the Jesuits. But as foreign influence deepened, his suspicion grew. In 1587, he banned Christian proselytizing and ordered missionaries expelled. Though loosely enforced, it signaled the start of Japan's long hostility toward Western faith. Then came his greatest gamble, the Korean invasions. In the early 1590s, Hideyoshi launched two massive campaigns against the Korean peninsula, intending to use it as a gateway to conquer China. At first, his armies triumphed. But Korean resistance, Chinese intervention, and endless supply problems turned victory to disaster. The Imjin Wars bled Japan's treasury and cost countless lives. They exposed the limits of Japanese power and the folly of overreach. By the time Hideyoshi withdrew, his health was failing, and his once glorious ambition seemed consumed by delusion. In his final years, he sought to secure his legacy. He appointed a council of 5 regents, among them Tokugawa Ieyasu, to rule until his young son Hideyori came of age. But like so many plans born of ambition, it did not survive its maker. Hideyoshi died in 1598. He left behind a unified Japan, a disciplined society, and an enduring vision of centralized power. Yet, without his hand to guide it, the nation he had built teetered once again on the edge of war. After the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1598, the fragile order he had built began to unravel. His success in unifying Japan and enforcing a strict administrative system could not mask the instability left behind. His heir, Toyotomi Hideyori, was only a child, and although Hideyoshi had established a council of regents to govern until his son came of age, the balance among them was doomed from the start. Among these regents, one man stood apart, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the most powerful, calculating, and patient of them all. A survivor of countless wars and shifting alliances, Ieyasu had learned to outlast every rival. He had once served both Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, navigating betrayal and chaos with unshakable restraint. By the time of Hideyoshi's passing, Ieyasu controlled vast territories across the eastern provinces, with Edo, later known as Tokyo, as his fortified seat of power. As months passed, the council meant to preserve Toyotomi rule became a battlefield of politics and ambition. Ieyasu began consolidating power, forging alliances through marriage, rewarding loyal daimyo, and placing his supporters in strategic positions across Japan. His growing influence alarmed the Toyotomi loyalists, chief among them Ishida Mitsunari, a bureaucrat turned commander who remained fiercely devoted to Hideyoshi's legacy. Though not a warrior by birth, Mitsunari was clever, disciplined, and determined to stop Tokugawa supremacy. He gathered powerful allies from western Japan, the Mori, Uesugi, and Shimazu clans, and raised an army to defend the Toyotomi cause. Thus, Japan split in two. The Eastern Army under Tokugawa Ieyasu and the Western Army led by Ishida Mitsunari prepared for a reckoning. In the autumn of 1600, their forces marched toward a narrow valley in Mino province, Sekigahara, the strategic crossroads of the realm. The terrain was open yet flanked by wooded hills, ideal for a decisive confrontation. More than 100,000 warriors, samurai, ashigaru, and retainers assembled for the fate of the nation. On the 21st day of the 9th lunar month, a heavy fog settled over the plain. When it lifted, the two armies clashed in thunderous combat. At first, the battle seemed evenly matched, each side driving hard against the other. But Ieyasu had prepared a deeper game. In the weeks before the battle, he had secretly negotiated with key commanders of the Western Army, most notably Kobayakawa Hideaki, whose loyalty was uncertain. As the struggle reached its height, Ieyasu ordered cannon fire toward Hideaki's position to test his resolve. Moments later, Kobayakawa turned on his own allies, leading his men in a furious charge against Mitsunari's flank. Panic spread through the western lines. Other wavering commanders followed, betraying Mitsunari and joining Tokugawa's side. By midday, the Western Army had collapsed. Mitsunari was captured while fleeing and executed soon after in Kyoto. His allies were exiled, stripped of lands or slain. The field of Sekigahara became the grave of Toyotomi power and the birthplace of a new order. Tokugawa Ieyasu now stood as Japan's unchallenged master. The victory at Sekigahara was not merely a triumph of arms. It was the foundation of a political revolution. In the years that followed, Ieyasu systematically reorganized the country. Loyal retainers received vast domains, while defeated lords were relocated or destroyed. Through this calculated redistribution, Ieyasu ensured that every strategic province was under Tokugawa control. In 1603, he was granted the title Sei Taishogun by the emperor, formally establishing the Tokugawa Shogunate. Thus began the Edo period, an age of peace, order, and isolation that would endure for over 2.5 centuries. Unlike earlier shogunates built on endless warfare, Ieyasu's regime pursued balance, discipline, and continuity. His philosophy was shaped by centuries of bloodshed. To preserve power, one must control ambition. The Tokugawa system rested on 3 pillars: rigid social hierarchy, surveillance of the daimyo, and the moral justification of Tokugawa authority. Among his most effective measures was the Sankin Kotai policy, which required each daimyo to alternate residence between his own domain and Edo, while leaving his family behind as effective hostages. This drained the lord's wealth and ensured their loyalty. Ieyasu also restricted castle construction, military mobilization, and marriage alliances, all requiring direct shogunal approval. Through these laws, he curbed the autonomy of the great lords while maintaining the illusion of feudal independence. The imperial court in Kyoto remained intact, but politically powerless. Ieyasu used the emperor's sacred authority as a source of legitimacy while retaining absolute control. The arrangement was subtle, divine rule preserved, but real power hidden behind the shogunate's seal. Tokugawa Ieyasu died in 1616, but his system endured for generations. His descendants maintained peace, codified law, and built institutions that defined Japan for centuries. The samurai, once defined by war, entered a new existence. No longer battlefield warriors, they became bureaucrats, scholars, and guardians of order. Their swords, once stained with blood, became symbols of status. The Edo period transformed Japan's soul. The warrior spirit that had forged the nation was now bound by discipline, honor, and duty. The samurai, now administrators, upheld a code of morality rooted in loyalty and restraint. Yet beneath this order simmered tension. Fixed stipends and rigid hierarchy left many samurai impoverished, while merchants, officially the lowest class, grew wealthy through trade and finance. The old balance between honor and power began to blur. Still, for over 2 centuries, the Tokugawa shogunate maintained a fragile, disciplined peace. When Ieyasu's body was laid to rest at Nikko, it was said that the age of chaos had ended. The sword had fulfilled its final duty, not to conquer, but to preserve. Japan, once torn apart by warlords, now stood united under one name, one peace, and one enduring legacy, the House of Tokugawa. Despite the passage of time and the shifting purpose of their class, the samurai remained central to Japan's political and cultural identity. The ideals of Bushido, the way of the warrior, became more than a tradition. They evolved into a moral philosophy that defined an entire era. Once a loose set of warrior values, Bushido was refined and codified during the Edo period under the influence of Neo-Confucian ethics. Loyalty to one's lord, filial piety, honor, restraint, and the readiness to die in service became the pillars of samurai virtue. The sword, once a tool of battle, now stood as the ultimate symbol of that virtue. Though large-scale warfare had vanished, the wearing of 2 swords, the long katana and the short wakizashi, remained the mark of a samurai's identity. Swordsmanship schools thrived and martial arts endured not for war, but for discipline and spiritual refinement. Through the Sankin Kotai system, the Tokugawa shogunate maintained tight control over the daimyo, requiring them to alternate years between their domains and Edo, leaving their families as hostages to ensure loyalty. This policy prevented rebellion, strengthened centralized authority, and led to a vast network of roads and communication routes that bound Japan into a unified whole. The peace that followed brought not stagnation, but cultural brilliance. Samurai became both patrons and participants in a flowering of art, theater, and literature. The kabuki stages of Edo and Osaka echoed with tales of loyalty and vengeance. Woodblock prints captured vivid scenes of urban life. Poetry, calligraphy, and tea ceremonies blended discipline with beauty. The samurai, while preaching austerity, found themselves drawn to the refinement of city culture. Yet beneath the harmony of Edo's society, contradictions simmered. By the 18th century, economic inequality among the samurai had deepened. Some families retained wealth and influence through high administrative posts, while others sank into debt and decline. The image of the impoverished or jobless samurai, wandering, proud, and disillusioned, became a staple of literature and drama. Efforts to reform the system surfaced periodically. Thinkers like Yamaga Soko and later scholars such as Arai Hakuseki sought to restore moral clarity through a revival of Bushido ideals, urging a return to sincerity, simplicity, and discipline. But moral reform could not repair structural decay. Fixed stipends and rigid hierarchies could not keep pace with an evolving commercial economy. By the late 18th century, the samurai stood between memory and modernity. They still carried swords, held social prestige, and recited the virtues of Bushido, yet their world had become one of bureaucracy and ink, not battle and blood. The katana hung in homes as a sacred relic, a reminder of duty, not a weapon of war. The battlefield had become the ledger. In this peaceful age, Bushido itself underwent transformation. No longer a set of practical combat principles, it became an ethical code, a way to define what it meant to live honorably without war. The term Bushido was rarely used in medieval times. Older warriors had lived by instinctive values of loyalty and courage, not written doctrine. It was during the Tokugawa peace, especially after the 17th century, that Bushido was shaped into a coherent philosophy drawing from Confucian thought, Zen Buddhism and samurai heritage. Yamaga Soko, a 17th century philosopher and former soldier, played a defining role in this evolution. Trained in Neo-Confucian teachings, he argued that in a time without war, the samurai must serve as moral examples for all of society, combining discipline, humility, and learning with the spirit of the warrior. The sword, he said, was no longer for conquest but for character. To carry it in Edo, Japan, meant to embody restraint, honor, and virtue. Kaibara Eken, another influential Neo-Confucian scholar, reinforced these ideas. Though not a warrior himself, his writings on filial piety and social order deeply influenced the samurai class, especially those serving as teachers and administrators. His teachings linked personal morality to the health of the state, affirming that a disciplined soul was essential to national stability. These principles found poetic expression in one of the most famous samurai texts ever written, Hagakure, compiled in the early 18th century by Tsurumoto Toshiro from the reflections of Yamamoto Tsunetomo. Though written after the age of war, Hagakure burned with nostalgia for a vanished era of valor. It taught that the way of the warrior is death, not as a morbid creed, but as a call to selflessness, to act without hesitation, free from fear or ego. The samurai, it declared, must live as though already dead, so that his every act might reflect unwavering loyalty. Hagakure was obscure in its time, but would later become one of the most influential articulations of the samurai spirit. The romanticization of samurai ideals reached into every corner of popular culture. Kabuki plays, illustrated books, and woodblock prints retold stories of heroism, vengeance, and sacrifice from earlier centuries, the Yenpei Wars, the Sengoku conflicts, painting the samurai as paragons of devotion in an age that no longer required their swords. Among these tales, none resonated more deeply than the story of the 47 Ronin. In the early 18th century, this true event shook Edo society. Lord Asano Naganori of the Ako domain, humiliated by the corrupt court official Kira Yoshinaka, lost his composure and drew his sword within Edo Castle, a grave offense punishable by death. Ordered to commit seppuku that same day, his retainers were left masterless, stripped of honor and purpose. For over a year they concealed their rage, plotting revenge under the guise of submission. Then, in the winter of 1701, they struck, storming Kira's mansion, killing him, and restoring their lord's dignity. Afterward, they turned themselves in and were ordered to die by ritual suicide. Their act electrified the nation. It was seen as the ultimate embodiment of Bushido, loyalty beyond death, duty beyond reason. The 47 Ronin became legends, immortalized in plays, poetry, and prints. In their sacrifice, Japan saw both the tragedy and glory of the samurai spirit. By the end of the 18th century, Bushido had become more than a moral code. It was the spiritual backbone of the Tokugawa world. Its teachings shaped samurai households, guided governance, and inspired all classes to live by discipline and duty. though interpreted differently across regions, some stressing Confucian order, others Zen detachment or martial resolve. All shared a belief that the samurai remained the moral compass of the nation. Bushido endured not because Japan still needed warriors, but because it needed meaning. In an age of peace, the sword became the soul, and the way of the warrior became the way of life. His lands were seized, his household dissolved, and his retainers cast adrift as masterless men. These newly made ronin were left without income, position, or protection, their honor suspended between duty and despair. The event sent tremors through Edo and across the nation. To many observers, Asano's punishment was legal but merciless. Yet to his retainers, it was an unbearable stain on their lord's name, one that demanded atonement. Among them was Oishi Yoshio, chief counselor of the Asano family, a man of experience and restraint. Oishi resolved to defend his lord's legacy, believing that Kira Yoshinaka, whose arrogance and insults had provoked the fatal encounter, bore moral responsibility for the tragedy. Still, revenge meant defiance of the shogunate, for private vengeance was forbidden and punished as rebellion. Instead of acting rashly, Oishi and the others dispersed, biding their time. Over the following year, they lived as if resigned to disgrace. Oishi, in particular, disguised his true intent by adopting a life of excess and idleness in Kyoto, drinking openly and feigning moral decay. To outsiders, he appeared to have abandoned all loyalty. But the deception was deliberate, a mask to divert suspicion while the ronin watched, waited, and planned. In the 12th month of the year 1702, nearly 2 years after their lord's death, the 47 ronin gathered once more in Edo. Under Oishi's calm command, they launched a precise midnight assault on Kira's mansion. Though fortified and guarded, the estate fell swiftly. The ronin fought with discipline, sparing the innocent and avoiding needless violence. At last, they found Kira hiding in a storage chamber and struck him down. Their vengeance complete, they did not flee. Instead, in solemn procession through Edo's snowy streets, they carried Kira's severed head to Sengakuji Temple, where they laid it before Asano's grave as an offering of restored honor. Then, without protest, they surrendered to the authorities. The shogunate now faced an impossible dilemma. The ronin had defied the law, yet their actions embodied the highest virtues of loyalty and sacrifice. Across Japan, people hailed them as heroes, men who had given their lives to justice, not to rebellion. After long deliberation, the shogunate delivered its judgment. The 47 were sentenced to death, but permitted to commit seppuku, an honorable end reserved for samurai. On the 4th day of the 2nd month in the year 1703, they performed the ritual with calm dignity. Buried beside their lord at Sengakuji, they became objects of national reverence. Their story spread swiftly through the land. Plays, poems, and ballads retold their deeds, shaping the legend known as Chushingura. Audiences wept and cheered, finding in their defiance a mirror of virtue in an age of conformity. The tale's power lay in its paradox. The ronin had broken the law, yet upheld a greater moral order. They defied authority but remained bound to honor. They spurned survival and chose death to preserve integrity. In an era of peace where swords rusted and ideals dimmed, the 47 reminded the nation of what it meant to live and die with purpose. For generations, they became the living emblem of Bushido. Artists, philosophers, and statesmen drew upon their courage as a model of absolute devotion. To a weary samurai class burdened by debt and disillusion, the ronin offered redemption, a return to meaning through sacrifice. Their legacy deepened with time, later revived in modern Japan as a symbol of collective spirit and national identity. Yet within the Tokugawa peace, their act stood apart as a rare flame in a quiet age, a reminder that the warrior's heart though bound by law, could still burn with ancient fire. By the late 18th century, the Tokugawa Shogunate had ruled for over 200 years. Its peace had transformed Japan, economically, politically, and culturally. But beneath this calm surface, unease was growing. For the samurai, the very peace they upheld had stripped them of purpose. The warrior elite had become bureaucrats, their swords ornamental, their stipends shrinking with inflation. Once placed above all others, they now found themselves outpaced by merchants who, though officially the lowest class, had grown rich through trade, credit, and enterprise. The samurai, paid in rice stipends fixed for generations, watched as costs rose and debts deepened. Many sold possessions or secretly entered commerce, forbidden though it was. Some took humble teaching posts. Others begged from wealthier kin. The contradiction between noble ideals and daily hardship grew unbearable. These men were heirs to legends of courage, yet their lives were ruled by paperwork and poverty. In Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto, disillusioned samurai gathered in study circles, seeking meaning in scholarship as the battlefield faded to memory. Some turned inward to revive lost virtue. Thinkers like Aizawa Seishisai and Motori Norinaga rejected imported doctrines, calling instead for a return to native spirit. Aizawa warned of corruption and foreign threat, urging renewed loyalty to the emperor. Motori found wisdom in Japan's ancient texts and Shinto belief, arguing for cultural purity over Confucian order. Their movement, Kokugaku, or national learning, revealed a quiet rebellion of the mind, a challenge to the Tokugawa's authority masked as philosophy. But ideas alone could not calm a nation strained by hunger and misrule. In the 19th century, disasters multiplied. Famines, floods, and failed harvests devastated the people. The Great Tempo famine of the 1830s exposed the shogunate's paralysis. Rebellions flared. Even samurai joined protests. Some domains launched reforms, experimenting with local industry and relief, but the cracks in the system widened. Culturally, however, the late Edo period thrived. The arts of the city, ukiyo-e prints, kabuki theater, satire, and song flourished under merchant patronage. Samurai, once patrons themselves, now became subjects of ridicule, stiff, broke, trapped in obsolete codes. The shonin, the merchant townsman, defined the new spirit of Japan, vibrant, ironic, and alive. The samurai, still adorned with two swords, walked among them as relics of a fading world. By the mid-19th century, the contradiction could no longer hold. The samurai still preached honor, but many lived in quiet shame. The Tokugawa system endured through habit, not conviction. And beyond Japan's shores, a greater storm was gathering. The Western powers, armed with iron ships and modern guns, were approaching Asia. The peace that had once defined Japan was nearing its end, and with it, the long twilight of the samurai. Japan had long remained a land of closed gates, bound by over 2 centuries of deliberate isolation. Yet the tides of the world were shifting, and its shores could no longer resist the approach of foreign winds. The arrival of Western ships, led most notably by the Americans under Commodore Perry, shattered the calm illusion of safety and forced the Tokugawa regime to confront its own fragility. But even before this intrusion, many among the samurai were already wrestling with a sense of uncertainty about their place in a changing world. Some looked upon the foreign presence as a path to renewal, a way to strengthen their country through learning and adaptation. Others recoiled, fearing that Western influence would dissolve the ancient virtues of honor and discipline that had defined their code. Across the islands, in castle towns and domain schools, experiments began in secret. Samurai scholars studied foreign sciences, anatomy, navigation, and the mechanics of war, sensing that an age of gunpowder and industry was approaching, one in which valor alone would no longer suffice. In this climate of tension and transition, the the very essence of what it meant to be samurai hung in question. Would they cling to the ghosts of a fading order or evolve into the architects of a new Japan? Could Bushido coexist with modern power? For the first time in generations, these questions had no certain answer. For over 200 years, Japan had lived under the strict isolationist rule of the Tokugawa Shogunate, a policy known as sakoku. Foreign trade was restricted to a narrow window in Nagasaki, mediated only through Dutch and Chinese merchants, and travel beyond Japan's borders was forbidden. This seclusion had insulated the nation from the chaos of colonial conquest, preserving peace and culture, but at the cost of technological stagnation. By the middle of the 19th century, however, the walls of isolation began to crumble under the pressure of a rapidly industrializing world. The breaking point came in the year 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy entered Edo Bay, commanding his squadron of ominous black steamships. He bore a letter from President Millard Fillmore demanding that Japan open its ports to trade, backed not by diplomacy alone, but by the visible might of American naval power. The shogunate, already weakened by economic strain and internal dissent, stood paralyzed. To refuse risked destruction. To comply meant humiliation. Seeking time to deliberate, they stalled Perry's demands, but he vowed to return, and did so a year later with an even greater show of force. In 1854, under immense pressure, the Tokugawa signed the Treaty of Kanagawa. It opened the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate, promised humane treatment of shipwrecked sailors, and began formal relations with the United States. It was the first crack in Japan's long wall of isolation. Soon, other Western powers, Britain, Russia, France, the Netherlands, followed, securing their own unequal treaties that granted them special privileges and trade advantages. To many Japanese, these concessions felt like national disgrace. To the samurai, they were an unforgivable betrayal of sovereignty. Discontent spread through the domains. Reformist daimyo, loyalist scholars, and restless warriors began to unite under the rallying cry, Sono Joy. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Among them rose Sakamoto Ryoma, a forward-thinking samurai from the Tosa domain. Once opposed to all foreign influence, he came to realize that survival demanded modernization. It was Ryoma who brokered the crucial alliance between the powerful domains of Satsuma and Choshu, paving the way for the movement that would topple the shogunate itself. Yet within the samurai ranks, unity was fleeting. Some clung to the shogunate, believing reform could come from within. Others embraced imperial restoration as the only path to national renewal. Young samurai, especially those from lower families, studied Western sciences and tactics with fervor, seeing in modern knowledge a new expression of Bushido's spirit, discipline not for lords, but for the nation. The shogunate's attempts at reform, founding naval academies, purchasing modern weapons, and sending emissaries abroad, proved too little, too late. The authority of the Bakufu was collapsing. In 1867, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the 15th shogun, resigned, formally returning power to the emperor in Kyoto. He hoped to preserve Tokugawa influence through compromise, but events soon escaped his control. In early 1868, loyalist forces from Satsuma and Choshu declared the restoration of imperial rule, igniting the Boshin War. Battles swept across the islands, culminating in the fall of Edo, renamed Tokyo, and by the summer of 1869, the Tokugawa shogunate was no more. Under the restored Emperor Meiji, Japan was reborn. The Meiji Restoration was not merely a political shift, it was a complete revolution. The feudal order was dismantled, the old domains replaced by prefectures, the hereditary privileges of the samurai abolished in the name of modernization. Stipends were converted into bonds, swords were banned from public wear, and the proud warrior class that had ruled Japan for centuries found itself without purpose or power. Yet even in defeat, the samurai spirit endured. Former warriors became soldiers, officials, diplomats, and educators. Their values, discipline, loyalty, service, were woven into the very fabric of the modern nation they helped create. Commodore Perry's arrival had done more than open Japan's ports. It had opened its eyes. The sword had met the machine, and from that collision emerged a new identity. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 marked the death of feudal Japan, but also its rebirth. It was the final trial of the samurai, forcing them to prove that Bushido could survive, not as a relic of the past, but as the moral backbone of a modern empire, one that would rise from isolation to power in the decades ahead. This decree, known as the Heitorei Edict, stripped the samurai of their most visible symbol, the sword. While the law applied broadly across society, its meaning for the samurai was profound. For centuries, the two-sword tradition had defined not only their social standing, but their very identity. The sword was more than a weapon, it was a moral emblem, a cultural icon, a piece of the soul itself. To be forced to relinquish it was to endure a symbolic death. At the same time, Japan created a modern national army. In the year 1873, universal conscription was introduced, mandating that all able-bodied men serve, regardless of social class. Soldiers now trained in Western military tactics, donned uniforms instead of armor, and wielded rifles in place of swords. The exclusive martial role of the samurai had ended. These sweeping reforms left many former samurai feeling betrayed and unmoored. Some adapted, finding positions as civil servants, educators, or entrepreneurs. Others entered the imperial military or police forces. Yet, for a significant number, particularly those of lower rank or struggling economically, the loss of privilege and income was devastating. This unrest erupted into a series of samurai-led rebellions during the early Meiji era. The most famous was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, a revered samurai and former Meiji official. Saigo had initially supported the restoration and held high office in the early government, but growing disillusionment with the reforms, the erosion of samurai values, and the government's decision to forego expansion into Korea pushed him to resign. Returning to his native Satsuma, he established a private military academy, which became a rallying point for disaffected warriors. In the spring of 1877, open hostilities erupted between Saigo's forces and the imperial army. Despite courage and determination, the rebellion was doomed. The imperial army, equipped with modern weaponry and trained in Western tactics, vastly outmatched the samurai rebels. After months of fighting, the insurgents were defeated. The final stand at Shiroyama saw Saigo, wounded and surrounded, reportedly take his own life, though the precise circumstances remain debated. The defeat of the Satsuma Rebellion marked the final resistance of the samurai class to Meiji reforms. The age of the warrior had ended. In the years that followed, Japan pressed forward with industrialization, railway construction, and the sending of students abroad to study Western sciences. Samurai transitioned fully into civilian roles. Many became entrepreneurs, leveraging discipline and education to excel in commerce. Others entered academia, journalism, or politics, redirecting the values of loyalty, perseverance, and public service to serve the nation in new ways. Although the samurai as a legal class disappeared, their cultural memory endured. Literature, theater, and later cinema romanticized the world of swords and honor. Figures like Saigo Takamori were remembered as tragic heroes, noble defenders of a vanishing order. Bushido was reimagined not as a class code, but as a national ethic. The Meiji government itself promoted these ideals to cultivate discipline, loyalty, and sacrifice among citizens, framing the samurai legacy as a cornerstone of national identity. In the early 20th century, as Japan industrialized and expanded its empire, samurai values permeated education, military training, and political discourse. The idealized Bushido became a moral framework for modern citizenship and military service. Loyalty, obedience, and the willingness to sacrifice for a higher cause. During World War II, these principles were amplified, with kamikaze pilots and soldiers urged to emulate the ultimate selflessness of the samurai. Yet this interpretation simplified and politicized Bushido, leaving aside the historical complexity, diversity, and debate inherent in the tradition. After Japan's defeat in 1945, the wartime militarized version of the samurai was discredited. Still, the deeper legacy survived. In the post-war period, samurai were celebrated as cultural icons, figures of integrity, discipline, and moral courage. Filmmakers such as Akira Kurosawa explored their inner conflicts, ethical choices, and human struggles in classics like Seven Samurai and Harakiri. Abroad, the samurai became symbols of Japanese uniqueness and tradition, influencing martial arts, business culture, and global popular imagination. Today, the influence of the samurai persists in many facets of Japanese life. Museums preserve their armor and weapons. Schools teach their history. Cultural festivals reenact battles and ceremonies. Their values, discipline, loyalty, responsibility, continue to resonate even in a modern, urban, globally connected society. The legacy of the samurai is not a linear tale from battlefield to museum. It is a layered history of transformation, from provincial warriors to rulers, from sword-bearing elites to civil administrators, from abolition to cultural myth. Their story shows that identity can adapt, tradition can be repurposed, and historical figures are always reshaped by changing contexts. Samurai were never only warriors, they were poets, monks, philosophers, reformers, and rebels. Their values were diverse, debated, and continually redefined. Their decline was gradual, shaped by social, economic, and political forces. Their memory today is active, a continuing conversation about living with purpose, responsibility, and conviction. Ultimately, the samurai are not just a chapter of Japan's past, they are part of its ongoing story, reflected in its culture, its values, and its search for identity in the modern age. This concludes the saga of the samurai, their rise, their transformation, and their enduring legacy, a history forged in steel, tempered by peace, and carried forward not only in weapons and armor, but in the memory of a nation,